Today's daf is Masechet Sheqalim Daf Gimel. As we were just speaking, pre-gaming the discussion, the Masechet Sheqalim is actually a Masechet of Talmud Yerushalmi, not Bavli. There is no Bavli on Masechet Sheqalim. The reason why it was included in the Daf Yomi cycle and why it's printed in the Shas of Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, is probably because since most of the Masechtot, almost all of them, in Seder Moed have Talmud in Talmud Bavli, and there was only one Masechet that would be missing, so they decided to append to it the Masechet from Yerushalmi, as opposed to, let's say, Masechet Nida or Masechet Berachot. Masechet Nida, none of the Shas, Seder Tahorot, which contains Masechet Nida, none of the other Masechtot have any Gemara in either one of the Talmudim. But Masechet Berachot is in Seder Zera'im. All of the Masechtot have both Bavli and Yerushalmi. All the Masechtot have Yerushalmi, and Berachot has Bavli and Yerushalmi. But since we only do one Masechet in the Bavli cycle of the entire Seder Zera'im, so they didn't see fit to include the entire Yerushalmi Seder Zera'im in the Daf Yomi. But here we're doing the entire Seder Moed except for one Masechet. So they included Sheqalim for some reason, for that reason perhaps, in the Talmud Bavli. So in all sets of the Talmud Bavli you find Masechet Sheqalim. But anyway, as we're going to see, Talmud Yerushalmi is a little bit more difficult, as I was just mentioning, for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is Girsaot. There are many variant manuscripts. There weren't enough manuscripts, actually. There wasn't enough editing done, so there are a lot of mistakes, a lot of corrections, a lot of cases where the words are incorrect, the phrases are out of order, the language is very stilted, the transitions are very rough rather than being smooth, sentences are not completely fleshed out, questions are not answered, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of unusual, almost like rough edges left on the Yerushalmi, as we're going to see. But we're going to start from the very top line of Daf Gimel. You'll also notice that in Yerushalmi, instead of being called Mishnayot, they're called Halachot. The Mishnah is called Halacha, Halacha Aleph, Halacha Bet, Halacha Gimel, etc. Now, in the regular printing of Yerushalmi, you don't have Dapim. You don't have Dapim starting from Bet like we do. There was no standard Yerushalmi. Only for Sheqalim, because it was included in the Shas Bavli, were their dapim starting from daf bet in the traditional form. In a regular Talmud Yerushalmi, you'll find that it starts on Aleph, and it's dependent on the version that you buy, depending on the printing that you buy, the pages are different. There's no set pages. Therefore, usually when you see references to Yerushalmi, you see Halacha Aleph in Perek Aleph, or Halacha Bet in Perek whatever, and then you have to look up the Halacha and you have to read through the whole Gemara to find it. Thankfully, in the Yerushalmi, the Sugyot in the Gemara are much shorter, as we're going to see. So we're at the top of Gimel, and it says like this: It's talking about the month of Adar, and specifically the first Mishnah was speaking about what happens on the 1st of Adar, things that happen on the 1st of Adar, and things that happen on the 15th of Adar. And among the things that happen on the 15th of Adar are, of course, that the Megillah is read in certain cities on the 15th of Adar. They start working on the roads, fixing up the streets, replenishing mikvaot that may have become filled with mud during the winter time, and of course in anticipation of those who are going to come up for Pesach, probably for the holiday, and they're going to need the mikvaot. And they do all the tzorchei rabim. They do all of the needs of the community. So the Gemara is going to ask, what does this mean? Elohen tzorchei rabim. These are the tzorchei rabim. These are the needs of the community that are going to be done, that are going to be performed on the 15th of Adar, or going to begin to be performed. Danin dinei mamonot, any monetary cases that were left over for the bet din are going to be taken up. V'dinei nefashot, if there are any death penalty cases. Dinei makot, any capital punishment, corporal punishment cases, not capital punishment, but makot, where they whip the person, where they punish the person with physical punishment, but not the death penalty. Or podin arachin, if somebody made a vow of erki alai, he said, my value, I will donate my value. But he didn't say my monetary value, he said my erech. The Torah gives a specific monetary value dependent on your gender and your age, called an erech. If you're going to, and there is a Masechet erech, Arachim that discusses erech much later on in Shas, but basically the erech that a person has is fixed by the Torah. It's not dependent on their actual value, but it's dependent on their age and their gender. So if a person made that kind of a commitment, then the bet din is going to come around and is going to collect from you at this time. V'haramim, if you made a cherem means my house, I'm making my house a cherem to the Bet HaMikdash. Now you have to give the value of your house to the Beit HaMikdash. The hekdeshot, things that you consecrate, they're going to collect them. Umashkinet sotah, if there were any women who were on board to become a sotah, that they had to be given the special potion to drink, they would do that starting on the 15th of Adar. In other words, court is in session, basically, you could say. All of these unresolved cases are going to be addressed with Sorfinet Para. If they need to burn a Para Aduma, they're going to do it now. Orfinet Egla Arufa. If they have an Egla Arufa, they have an unsolved homicide and they needed to decapitate a calf, as we know the Torah tells us to do when an unsolved homicide occurs in between two cities. So they do this on the 15th of Adar. If there's a slave who doesn't want to leave after 6 years of servitude but wants to stay permanently with his master until the Yovel, so we know that we have to make a hole in his ear. That's going to be done starting on the 15th of Adar. If there are any mitzoraim who need purification, we start their process on the 15th of Adar. According to the Rambam, what this means is we unlock the reservoirs. In other words, we consider them to be full now from the rainwater of the winter, and now we're going to open the reservoir so people can start to take water out of it. So in other words, all of these things obviously were not done exactly on the 15th of Adar, but what it means to say is that they start, the process for all of these things is going to get rolling on the 15th of Adar, that court is back in session. Life is functioning again. We don't return the lock to the reservoir. What do you mean?
Okay, so you have a case of sota, whatever, like all of the things that were listed before the 14th of Adar.
Apparently, you had to wait till court was in session for it to be addressed. Just like
court was in session.
It started the 15th of Adar through the summertime, and then apparently in the winter time, at some point in the winter time, the rainy season, these things were put on hold. And then they would restart on the 15th of Adar to do all these things.
Just 15th of Adar, and then
I don't know when it ended exactly. But yeah.
And then it stopped for the rest of the year.
They had recess in the winter.
And then it
apparently they had recess in the winter from all these things. A lot of them take place outside, so you could see why a lot of these things would be suspended for the winter time. But the court cases, it's not clear why. It sounds like they just had a recess during this time.
Rabbi, is it an unsolved homicide or a dead body?
A dead body that they assume is a homicide. That's assumed to be a homicide, yeah. Okay, so Taman Taninan. So here's an example of Yerushalmi. This is Aramit of the Yerushalmi. In Hebrew, in the Bavli, we would say Tanan Hatam. We taught over there. Here it says, instead in Yerushalmi language, so if you're trying to learn Bavli language all this time in the daf, don't hold your breath over here. Taman means hatam, it means over there. Taninan, we learn. Mashkin beta shelachayin, umitzaynin ala kivarot. It says in Masechet Moed Katan that we start to water the fields that need irrigation, and we mitzaynin ala kivarot, and we start to label graves. In other words, graves that require labeling, that require some kind of a headstone to mark them. We start doing this during Chol HaMoed. Okay, Chol HaMoed of Pesach is when we start addressing these issues. Fields that are in need of irrigation, and because they will die, they have a very severe need, and so the question is, Kvar Tzinume Adar. We just learned in this Mishnah that it's on the 15th of Adar that they go out and they start marking the graves. Why is it telling us that we should mark the graves on Chol HaMoed of Pesach? They already did it a month before. So what does it say? So it says V'tiftar. Now that is also Jerusalem Aramaic. V'tiftar is like we say liftor. It's Hebrew really, but it's Aramaic that's used in the Yerushalmi. It means an answer. The answer is Shi'arad Shetev Shel Gishamim Ushtafo, that they had a bad rainstorm in Adar and it wiped away all of the because what they used to use lime for the they would pour lime that would dry on the spot of the kever.
What's lime?
It's like what you use.
The concrete has lime in it. That's what makes the concrete stick together.
It's something that's they mix it and they pour it out and it dries. So that's what they would use. Now when the water comes, it washed it away, so they had to redo it. In other words, if they would originally do it on the 15th of Adar because you figure that the rainy season is over, but sometimes you have a surprise rainstorm and then you have to do it over again on Chol HaMoed. So it says that they went out to clear away the kilayim. In other words, they went out to see if anybody had any diverse seeds mixed in the field, that they had to uproot them. They wouldn't leave them in the fields. So it says that they would do that also on Chol HaMoed Pesach. So he asked the same question. Lo ukfar yatzu me'adar, didn't they already take care of this in Adar? So tiftar shayta shana afela ve'netzemachin nekarin. The point is that some years everything grows later, so you couldn't tell that they were mixed seeds because things didn't grow as quickly. Some years the season starts early, you see it earlier. Some years it's delayed. So in a year that it's delayed, we wait till Chol HaMoed Pesach. In a year that things grew early, we do it in 15th of Adar. Minayin letziyun. So now, right? Ki afilotena, like it says in the Torah, it talks about it. With in Vayera, actually, at the end of Vayera, when Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to Paro and he says that there's still things in the fields. Ki afilotena. So that's what it's saying here. So now the Gemara, as you could see, switches gears quickly. Minayin letziyun. How do we know this idea that you have to make a marking for graves? So Rav Berachia, Rabbi Yaakov bar Bat Yaakov, what? Oh, Rabbi Yaakov, the son of the daughter of Yaakov, b'shem Rabbi Chonia, Divrat Chavarin, from Vrat Chavarin, Rabbi Yosa, Amrela Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha, b'shem Rabbi Chonia, Divrat Chavarin, Rabbi Chizkiah, Rabbi Uziel Brei Rav Chonia Devet Chavran, b'shem Rabbi Chonia Devet Chavran. So you see that sometimes what the Yerushalmi does is it gives a whole list of people that might have said this.
Oh,
okay.
Because it might.
Right. So they. Right. So
it seems like there's even a lot more detail.
Right, but it's not even right. So it says Rabbi Berechia. Right, says that Rabbi Yaakov bar Bat Yaakov in the name of this person, and then Rabbi Yossi says that Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha in the name of this person, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different attributions here. But the point is, v'tameh tameh yikra. Where do we get the idea that you need tziyun kvarot, that you need to mark the graves? Because it says v'tameh tameh yikra. That when the person who is a mitzorah is outside the camp, v'tameh tameh yikra, he has to call out that he's tameh. So what does that mean? Kedei shetei hatum'ah kor'a lecha b'fiha. Ve'omer decha perosh. The tum'ah has to say to you, it has to call out and say, separate from me. So in other words, just like a mitzorah has to say, separate from me, we have to put something on the grave to tell the kohanim not to come there, or to tell people who have terumah or they have korbanot not to come there, so they don't become tamei. Rabbi Ilah b'shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. Rabbi Ilah in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani says, "Ve'avru ha'overim ba'aretz v'ra'a etzem adam uvana etzlo tziyun." So it says that this is talking about in the times of Gog and Magog, that the people are going to pass by and they're going to see a bone of a man and they're going to build next to it some kind of a marking. So what does this mean? So that shows you that you have to make a marking next to a bone. So etzem, the fact that it says etzem mikan shemitzainin ala atzamot, that means that we make a marking for bones. Adam, the fact that it says etzem adam means mikan shemitzainin ala shidra v'al gulgolet, that means that even if all you have is a spinal cord or a skull, you also make a marking. Uvana, and it says uvana mikan. This means that you use a stone that is fixed in place. You don't use a stone that could move. A stone that could roll, because then it's going to roll to the wrong place, and you're going to think that the tumah is in a different place. For that reason, it says bana. It uses the language of building, meaning that it has to be something even kvu'ah. So im omer. So then it says, Im omer at al gabe geven tilusha. If you're going to say on an even tilusha, on a rock that moves, afi olechet umitameh b'makom acher, then what's going to happen is you're going to think that the tumah is in a different place. So two things are going to happen. Number one, you're not going to know what the correct spot is where the tumah is. Number two is you're going to think that there's tumah in the place where the rock is, which might not be correct. So that's why you have to make sure to use a rock that stays in place, so you don't make a mistake. So what's so bad if you think there's extra tumah? It's bad because if you stepped in the place where the rock is, you're going to burn any holy thing that you had that came into contact with that area. So we don't want you to increase the number of places that are tamei inadvertently, nor do we want you to decrease the number. We want it to be accurate, and in order to be accurate, it can't move. Etzlo. Why does it say etzlo in the pasuk? Lamakom ta'ora. It means that it should enter into the place of purity. In other words, this rock should not just simply be covering the area where the tumah is, because then by the time you walk up to it, you're already over the tumah. It needs to jut out a little bit from the area of tumah into the area that's pure, so that by the time you see it, you're still in a pure area before you get too close. So it actually extends into, that's why it says etzlo, next to the tumah is where this rock should be, not necessarily directly on top of the tumah. And then it says, tziyun, mikan the tziyun. So that's what shows you that you need some kind of marking. It can't be a rock only, but you put some kind of a marking on it. That usually it's that was the lime. That was what they poured onto it. That kind of concrete stuff. That showed that this rock is actually not just any rock, but it's actually it's actually a marking of a grave.
Lime would also dissolve anything.
No. Lime dries up. What lime does is it dries up anything that it comes to contact with, so it hardens it.
It hardens it, yeah. So it says, Umatza even achat mitzuyenet, if a person finds one rock, which is mitzuyenet, which means it has this marking on it that shows it's a gravestone, even though we don't leave it like that. In other words, you can't just have one rock. Normally they would have more than one rock, actually. They would have a rock, they would have two rocks, and something in between. But when you had only one rock, if you find just one rock and it has the lime on it that shows that in fact it is a marking for a grave, if you lean over it, you're tameh. We assume, Ani Omer met mitzuyan, vayanutun tachteh. The implication is that they only put one rock, even though you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to put two rocks. So to make sure that people see it from far away.
At one end.
Right. So if you have only one, though, you assume that's where the person is buried, and if you lean over it, you're going to become tameh. Moreover, it says that if you have two rocks and a space in between, then you assume that the two rocks are actually the tahor place. They are the place where you can go up to. But between them, and in between them is where the grave is, not on top of them.
Like a headstone or footstone.
Right, so a headstone or footstone, exactly. Now, if in between the two rocks somebody plowed, then we assume that these are two independent graves, because they wouldn't have plowed where the person was buried. So again, then you're going to assume again that the two rocks are where the graves are, and in between is tahor. So you have to use some common sense in interpreting the situation here. Taneh, it was taught in mitzainin ala basar, shema nit'akel basar. If they bury just a small amount of human flesh without bone, we don't put a permanent marking on that spot. What's the reason? Because a person is going to end up thinking that if they stood on that rock, let's say if there's only flesh buried under there, it's going to decompose very quickly. So when the person comes by and they sit on that rock, they think they sat on a tameh place, but really whatever was under there disappeared 10 years ago because it didn't last very long. They're not going to realize that. So we don't put a permanent marking there for that. Rabbi Yosta bar Shunem ba'a kome Rabbi Mana. Rabbi Yosta bar Shunem asked in front of Rabbi Mana. Now notice the names of the rabbis are also very different in Yerushalmi. These are not the same names. Aren't you going to end up causing pure things to become tameh? In other words, if you don't mark it, at least in the beginning, right, for the first, when you first bury that flesh, it doesn't decompose immediately. What if that week somebody walks over there and he's going to be carrying terumah? It's going to become tameh. So why don't you mark it in advance? So the answer is, he says, better that just for this week it be bad, and somebody make a mistake and become tameh, or make something tameh, and not do it for all generations. That in a year from now, 2 years from now, every year people are going to go there and they're going to make things tameh. Better that they make a mistake now than that they do it in the future and end up burning things that are not really tameh at all. That's even worse.
And there's no marking.
And so what they said was, so the Mefarshim say, so what do you do about the temporary? So the point is that it's still a fresh grave. People are going to know about it. As long as it's a fresh grave, people are going to know about it. They're going to see it. There's less chance that they're going to make a mistake. So that also factors in. The new Mishnah, or as it's called in Yerushalmi, Halacha Bet. Halacha Bet. Matnitin Amar Rabbi Yehuda. When they used to go and they would assess people's farms or their gardens and see if they had any mixed seeds. They would pull out kilayim. They would pull out any diverse seeds that weren't allowed to be planted together, and they would throw them onto the ground and leave it for the owner to clean up. They would just pull it out and throw it. However, when the sinners got worse, there were more of them. They used to throw it into the street instead. We'll see why. And eventually they made a rule that anybody caught with kilayim in their field, they would make the entire field ownerless and let anybody come take whatever they wanted. So that was obviously a bigger penalty. We'll see how this evolved. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda says, Tanei, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, it says in the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda said, Barishona hayu okrinu mashlechin lifnehem vayu semechayin shtei semachot. In the beginning, when they would come, they would pull all the mixed seeds. Let's say a person had a wheat field, and they pulled out all of the cranberries. I don't know, whatever they're growing in there. Whatever. I don't know what they're growing. Strawberries. They pulled those strawberries and they threw them into the field. And why were they happy? They said, first of all, first of all, they were happy because they were weeding their field for them. Thanks a lot. You know what? I'm going to leave it in there because I know that Bet Din is going to come do my landscaping.
And then they were feeding the animals.
Right, and not only that, then they took whatever it was, they would benefit from it, they would give it to their animals. So when people started getting this attitude, so they were still happy for one reason, because they still had their fields weeded for them, but now they weren't going to benefit from what was plucked out because it was thrown into the streets and trampled on. So eventually they decided, we're just going to make your field completely ownerless. In other words, we're going to let anybody come take whatever they want. So now people are going to be proactive and they're going to make sure to take out all the kilayim because they don't want that to happen to them. How do we know that the Beit Din has the power to declare your property ownerless? As it says, this was Ezra. Ezra wanted everybody who was intermarried to report to the central command and to divorce the wives to whom they were intermarried during the Babylonian exile. There were a lot of intermarried families, a huge amount. So he summoned all of them and he said, anybody who doesn't show up for this meeting, everything all of his property is going to be confiscated. So what does that show you? It shows you that Beit Din has the power to confiscate. They have the power to control people's property.
There's a whole Masechet on Kilayim, right?
In the Yerushalmi, yes. Yeah. I mean, it's part of Seder Zra'im, so it doesn't have a bavli. How do we know that ownerless products, in other words, produce of an ownerless field that you take, does not have to have maaser taken from it? You don't have to separate maaser from it. How do we know that that's true? Because Rabbi Yonatan the Rav Yitzchak bar Acha shema la min hada. So now notice, it doesn't say like Amar Rabbi Yonatan. It just says Rabbi Yonatan, the son of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Acha. It's understood this is what he said. Right? It doesn't say the word he said. He just says Shema la min hada. Learn it from this. We never add an additional month. We don't make a leap year in the Shemitah year or the year following the Shemitah year. And if they did, it's effective. In other words, the Beit Din is not supposed to add a month, but if they did, it counts. Okay, so he says, isn't it true that the 1 month, in other words, what happens is like this: during Shemitah year, there's no maaser because nothing belongs to anybody. Right? Nothing belongs to anybody. So you don't have to take maaser. Whatever you take, you keep. Everybody's living on maaser basically because they're all receiving a gift. Everything is free. So you don't separate maaser. So what about if they make a leap year in that year, that extra month, the Beit Din is making it that those fields are ownerless for another month. Right? Because they're extending Shemitah. Now they're not allowed to, but if they did, it's effective. And that extra month that they added, whatever grows during that month, it's also not going to be subject to maaser because it's also Shemitah produce. So what do you see? The Chachamim, by making something hefker, making something ownerless, also remove the obligation for maaser. Because that's the only way it could work. That's the proof that he brings. So ad kadun is like ad kan in the Bavli. Ad kadun shvi'it. Up till now we talked about the shvi'it itself. Shemitah motzai shvi'it mai. What's the reason why they're not allowed to add an extra month in the year following Shemitah? So Amar Rabbi Abun it should be. Okay, according to what's on the side, or Rabbi Bun or Rabbi Avun, we're not sure which one. Shelo lerabot be'isur hadash, because since we know that there's a mitzvah in the Torah that you can't use the new crop, it's called chadash. You can't use the new crop until Pesach comes. Right? That's what's Chadash and Yashan. When you see places that says it's Yashan, it means it's only crop that was planted before Pesach for this year. So they would extend the problem another month because people are already waiting through Shemitah. They haven't been able to cultivate the land for a whole year. Then finally, when Shemitah is over, they're cultivating, and now they have to wait another month. They're still relying on food from 2 years ago that they stockpiled from the year before Shemitah. So what are they going to do? So therefore, we don't add a month to that year because we don't want to extend the prohibition on using the new grain another month. They've already been waiting a year. Now they're waiting another month to be able to harvest.
Three valid reasons.
What?
They basically agreed on 3 valid reasons.
No, there are different reasons. One reason was for the Shemitah itself.
I agreed upon that they're valid.
What's the 3?
That not to add on Chadash to
right, that was one. That's for the year after Shemitah.
Oh, that's not.
That's the year after Shemitah. And for the Shemitah itself, the reason was given because basically you're going to. It didn't give a reason for it, but the logical reason is obviously that you're extending the problem. You're extending the difficulty. I mean, it doesn't give that reason, but that's the obvious one. So then it says, Rabbi Zeira b'shem Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Zeira said, and then Rabbi Elazar, Hadad de Atamar, that which you said, that was ad shelo hitir Rabbi lavi yarak mechutz la'aretz. That was only until Rabbi allowed the people to import vegetables from outside of Israel la'aretz. Aval mishetir Rabbi lavi yarak mechutz la'aretz he shevi'it he shel sha'ar shnei shavua. Once Rabbi allowed them to import produce, we don't have the problem anymore. We can extend shevi'it. We can extend the shemitah year. Why? Because it doesn't matter that we can't cultivate our own land. We can import. We can import vegetables. Now, the point is, though, that still he proved his point that when the Rabbanan added a month onto Shemitah, that month is exempt from Maaser. They're making everybody's stuff ownerless and making it exempt from Maaser. It's a proof to the main point that he wanted to prove anyway. Amar Rabbi Mana says, Hadad at Amar, that which you said only applies in the early years, when the years were kitiknan, when the years were like they were supposed to be. But now that the years are not like they were supposed to be, it should say Motza'ei Shevi'it, I believe. He Motza'ei Shevi'it, he Shar Shnei Shavua. Because it used to be that things ripened really early, so people couldn't wait for the time to come that they would be able to harvest their stuff. So it was a really big issue to add an extra month onto Motza'ei Shevi'it, the year after Shemitah, because people finally got to cultivate, and they're waiting. He said that's only true in the times where the years followed the normal pattern. But nowadays, things are ripening later anyway. The pattern is that everything's ripening later, and since the pattern is that everything's ripening later, people are not as rushed to harvest, and so therefore it doesn't really matter. Even if you add an additional month, it's not going to affect anybody. Now, Tanei shel Beit Rabban Gamliel Ibrab Motei Shevi'it miyad, and in fact it says that in the house of Rabban Gamliel during his time he made a Shana Me'oberet on Motzei Shevi'it, on the year after Shemitah, and he didn't see any concern, because since things are ripening later anyway, the extra month is not going to affect anybody either way. Amar Rabbi Abun says, in min hada let ad shema min hakalom. This is Yerushalmi talk, right? In min hada, if you're proving it from that, okay. So then he says, let ad shema min hakalom. You can't learn anything from it. Why not? In other words, you can't learn anything from the fact that they added. Because what was the proof? The proof was that if you add a month onto Shemitah, you see that extra month is also everything is hefker and it's exempt from Maaser. You can't prove, though, that the Bet Din can do that all the time. Why? Because it's fulfilling a mitzvah. Shamoret Chodesh Aviv. Shomreu Shiaviu B'chidusho. Because there's a mitzvah from the Torah that you're supposed to add a month onto the year when you need Pesach to fall in the spring. So they're doing a mitzvah. So they're following the Torah. They're not just deciding we're going to make everybody's stuff hefker for another month and therefore it's going to be exempt from Maaser. No, the Torah says you have to do it.
When the month was added, Hillel at that time.
Right, when they added the month, then we always had to add months because our lunar calendar falls behind.
This started only from Hillel?
No, they always had to. Shamorat Chodesh Aviv. Otherwise we'd be like the Muslims and we would have Pesach in wintertime.
So what did
he just fixed the calendar so we don't have to do it. We don't have to figure out when to do it. He did it in advance, but he didn't originate it. In the time of Hillel, they fixed the calendar according to an algorithm, so nobody ever has to figure out when are we going to make a Shana Me'uberet. It's automatic. But before that, they still had to do it. But they decided each year, should we make Shana Me'uberet? They had to decide it every year. After Hillel, they didn't have to decide anything. He fixed it forever. Okay, so now it says V'hadaya Amrei Da. So now what the so this is also Yerushalmi language, and where's he explains it on the side here. He says V'hayeda Amrei Da means Ela Mehechan Muchach. From where do we learn that the Bet Din can make someone's stuff hefker, and when they make it hefker, that it's going to be exempt from Maaser? Where do we get this from? From a different case, because it says Gadish shelo lukat tachtav kol hanogaot ba'aretz areihen shel aniim. Leket is the extra sheaves and stuff that would fall as they were harvesting, right? And you're supposed to leave it for the poor people to come pick up. So somebody thought they were really smart, and instead of leaving those extra gleanings for the poor people, they piled their own produce on top of it and said, oh no, I don't have anything for the poor people. So what did the Bet Din do? They said, we're going to make it even worse. Anything that's touching the ground belongs to the poor people. Let's say there were only a few sheaves, he covered it over. Now everything touching the ground is going to belong to the poor people. But what does that mean? That means that you're exempting it all, you're making it all hefker for the poor people. And Va'amar Rabbi Ami said, Bishem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and then Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, the Bet Shammai. This has to be according to Bet Shammai. Why? Because according to Bet Shammai, you can do something called hefker la'aniyim. You can say, this is hefker, but only for poor people. But you can't say, according to Beit Hillel, because according to Beit Hillel, there's nothing you can do. Because you're not allowed, according to Beit Hillel, to say this is going to be a hefker only for aniyim. You have to say it's hefker for anybody, right? You're making it completely hefker or not. So they wouldn't be able to do that. So the Korban Edah here on the top, what does he say? So he says that this doesn't logically work out according to Beit Hillel. Rabbi Yosef says, Shamanu shu patur mi-ma'aser. We learn that even according to Beit Hillel, it's exempt from Ma'aser. How could it be exempt from Ma'aser? How can the rabbis designate this for the aniyim? If they're not allowed to make it hefker only for the aniyim, they would have to make it hefker for everybody. And if they transfer it to the ownership of the aniyim, then the aniyim are now going to have to take maaser from it. They can't just say it's hefker and we picked it up, it's hefker. They can't do that. So he says that according to this, so it's going to be divrei akol, that it's patrum maaser divrei akol, mishum knasa, because of a knas. In other words, the rabbis are allowed here to make a knas that first of all make it hefker, and second of all say that they're not going to be allowed to take it. That nobody's allowed to take it except the poor people. Okay, normally you can't do that. Normally we wouldn't be able to do that. But the rabbis made a knas and said, we're going to make this ownerless so that it doesn't require maaser, and it's only going to be allowed to be taken by the poor people. It's going to have the status of leket. So what happens then? That means that now the poor people come and they're able to take it and it's exempt from the maaser. But what do you learn from this? You learn from this that the Bet Din, when they make something hefker, can also exempt it from maaser through their legal device of hefker. So, and normally Beit Hillel wouldn't allow that kind of hefker, but this time they do in order to punish the guy who tried to take advantage of the poor people. Now the next halacha or Mishnah says, "B'chamisha asar bo," on the 15th of Adar, when they would collect the machatzit shekel, shulchanot hayu yoshevin b'medina, throughout Jerusalem. Okay, they would set up places for people to change the money, because you had to use the machatzit shekel. So you would bring money and you would change the money for machatzit shekel, for the coin of machatzit shekel that you had to use. So the cafe on the 25th of Adar, Yashvu b'mikdash, they would set up in the mikdash itself. Mish Yashvu b'mikdash etchilu lemashkin, and at that same time on the 25th of Adar, they started to go and seize people's property. In other words, they would force them to give them machatzit shekel. Either that means they would seize from their house the value of the machatzit shekel, or it means they would take other things and confiscate them, like ransom, and ask for ransom, and say, we're not going to give it back until you bring the machatzit shekel. At mime mashkinin, who did they do this kind of confiscation to? It could be Levites, Israelites, converts, and freed slaves, all of them. But not women, slaves, or minors, because they're not obligated to bring machatzit shekel, so we don't force them to bring it. They might be able to contribute if they want to, but we don't force them. And any child whose father started giving the machatzit shekel for him, like we do, we give also for the kids, right? Machatzit shekel when we symbolically do it. So then Shuvein posek, he can't stop doing it. Once he starts doing it, he can't stop, even though the child is not obligated to do it until he reaches the age of majority, as we're going to see. It's actually a machloket rishonim if it's 20 years old or 13 years old, but we're going to see what the Gemara here says. En memashkinin et hakohanim mipnei darkei shalom, and we never force the kohanim to give machatzit shekel because of darkei shalom. We don't want to get them angry. They do the avodah. We have to treat them with respect. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Hayid ben Bukhri b'Yavneh. Ben Bukhri and Yavneh testified that really the Kohanim don't have to bring the machatzit shekel, but any Kohen that brings the machatzit shekel, he's not doing a sin. Meaning he shouldn't do it, but if he did it, it's okay. Amar lo Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, Loki elakol kohen she'eno shokel chotet. It's the opposite. Any kohen that doesn't bring machatzit shekel is doing a sin. He has to bring it. The Kohanim made their own drasha from the pasuk to free themselves from bringing machatzit shekel. Why? Because they said because it says in the Torah that if you bring a mincha, if you bring a flour offering, then part of it is burnt on the mizbeach and part of it is eaten by the Kohanim. But if the Kohanim bring a flour offering, the entire thing has to be burnt. None of it can be eaten because they can't eat from their own. If a Kohen brings, the Kohanim can't eat from their own. So no Kohen is going to be able to eat from that mincha. So they said, their argument was like this, hey, wait a second. The problem is if we give machatzit shekel goes to buy all of the communal korbanot.
It's not theirs.
No, but if it becomes partially mine, then the shtei alechem of Shavuot, the lechem apanim that's brought every Shabbat, the Kohanim are supposed to eat it, right? The problem is, if we own part of it, then it's minchat kohen. It's property of the kohen in part, because we're giving them machatzit shekel too. And if it's machatzit shekel from us, then you're going to have a problem that you're not going to be able to consume those korbanot anymore. Do you understand why? If goes to the korbanot. Okay, so if the Kohanim own part of the communal korbanot that are supposed to be consumed, they won't be able to consume it because they're going to say, well, it's owned by the Kohen. So Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying that's not a good drasha. They're wrong, but they came up with that drasha to exempt themselves from paying.
I mean, the difference is that one is a direct ownership, the other one is...
It's communal ownership, but that's the whole thing. They're saying we own part of it. It's like each individual owns part of it. Right? So the Gemara says, we don't force the ketanim to pay. But we do request from them. In other words, we ask them to give. So it says if a child has not yet reached puberty, we don't require him to bring machatzit shekel. We ask him to bring machatzit shekel, but I'm sorry, the other way around. If he hasn't reached puberty, we don't bother him. If he has reached puberty, we pressure him to bring it, but if he doesn't bring it, we don't force him. Okay, he's not old enough to be forced. We don't confiscate his property to try to force him to do it. Okay, so ule mashkin en memashkinin. And it should say in the parentheses here, ad shiyehe ben esrim. We don't confiscate property until he reaches 20 years old, until he, even though he's reached puberty, so normally he's obligated in mitzvot, we don't force him to pay. In other words, we don't confiscate his property and try to strong-arm him into paying until he reaches 20 years of age. And what the Mishnah says, that we don't confiscate property from the Kohanim to force them to pay machatzit shekel, is because of kavod. It's in order to honor them. So it says darchei shalom for peace, but it means to give them respect. We shouldn't treat them disrespectfully. Amar Rabbi Yehuda said, hey Eid, this is the machloket whether the Kohanim have to give machatzit shekel or not. Amar Rabbi Berechia says, Tamad Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ze yitinu. Why does Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai say that the Kohanim have to give machatzit shekel? Because it says ze yitinu. Yud bet shvatim yitinu, because the gematria is 12. All 12 shvatim have to give machatzit shekel. Rabbi Tavi b'shem Rab Hamnuna. Rabbi Tavi said in the name of Rab Hamnuna, Ken b'shivin chachamim le Rabbi Yehuda. This is how the chachamim responded to Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda, who brought in the name of Ben Bukhri to exempt the Kohanim from machatzit shekel. The rabbis answered like this: Chatat yachid meta ve'en chatat tzibur meta. Minchat yachid kreva kalil ve'in minchat hatzibur kreva kalil. They said to him, listen, there's a difference between individual korbanot and communal, like you're saying. Individual korbanot have a different rule. An individual korban chatat, if the owner dies, you leave the animal to die. There's nothing you can do with it. A communal korban, we never leave it to die. Similarly, an individual korban, an individual mincha brought by a kohen has to be burnt. But a communal korban, a communal mincha which happens to be owned by a kohen, that doesn't mean we're going to burn it, because it's only partially owned by the kohen anyway. It's a communal korban. So the Gemara first interjects and says, "V'kasha meshivin la'adam davar she'no modebo." But can you really ask somebody based on something he doesn't agree with? Titnan, we learned in the Mishnah shin chatat tzibur meta. Rabbi Yehuda omer tamut. Actually, Rabbi Yehuda does hold that a communal korban, under certain circumstances, can be left to die. So how can you ask him from that one? How can you ask him from that case to show that there's a difference between individual and communal korbanot when Rabbi Yehuda actually holds that there is no difference in that that case. So the point is that doesn't really matter, because the main point was to show that there's a difference between communal and individual when it comes to minachot, when it comes to the burnt offerings. Right, the mincha of the kohen, the minchat yachid is burnt, but that doesn't mean that the mincha of the tzibur of the community is going to be burnt. Why? Because all these korbanot are being brought on behalf of the entire community all the time, including the kohanim. They're not all burnt. Not all these minachot are burnt. So that was the main point. So the Gemara never answers why they mentioned the other case that Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't agree with anyway. But he's going to answer us that Zolo nidvat yachid, but that is not a gift of an individual. Okay, that in other words, here the individual is giving machatzit shekel. So that individual piece that he owns in that korban is a piece of a kohen. It belongs to the kohen. Ve'inun metivin lei. They're going to answer him. Kevan shenimsar letzibur kemishun nidvat tzibur. Once you give it over to the community, once you hand your machatzit shekel over, it becomes communal property. We don't care. This one came from Matthias. This one came from this one. It doesn't work like that. It's all pulled together into a communal fund. So Ketiv, it's written, Kol ha'over ala pikudim, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia argue about what does it mean, Kol ha'over ala pikudim. Anybody who passes over the census, literally it means that they have to bring machatzit shekel. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia, they argue about this. Chad Amar, one of them says, Kol da'avar biyamma, anybody who passed through the sea. In other words, any Jew, Yiten, has to give. Kol ha'over means we're all overim, we all passed because we passed through the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. And one says v'charna. This means ve'idach in Bavli. The other one here it's v'charana. The other one amar kol davar al pikudaya yiten, that anybody who was involved in the main census would give, meaning not the Kohanim and Leviim, because they were not counted in the main census; they were counted in their own census. Man damar kol davar biyama yiten misayel Rabben Yochanan ben Zakkai. Man damar kol davar al pikudaya yiten misayel ben Bukhri. So the one that says anybody who passed through the ocean, anybody who passed through the sea has to give, he's supporting the view that even the Kohanim and Leviim have to give. The one that says only somebody who was involved in the main census has to give, that means that Kohanim and Leviim would not have to give it. And hence it's a machloket whether the Kohanim have to participate in machatzit shekel or not. And the argument of the Chachamim obviously is that, listen, if you're going to say that the Kohanim that own part of every korban tzibur that's brought on behalf of the community, so then you're going to have a problem with all of the korbanot that are brought throughout the year. That they're all on our behalf. They're all on behalf of the Kohanim as well. And his answer was no, because here he's giving a machatzit shekel. He's giving a piece from himself, so he retains a partial ownership in the korbanot that are brought from that one coin and the things that are purchased from it, and that's the machloket between the two sides.